The morning sun shimmered off manicured lawns, casting golden reflections on rows of nearly identical suburban homes. The kind of neighborhood where every mailbox stood at a 90-degree angle, porch flags swayed gently in unison, and one misplaced trash bin could trigger a neighborhood meeting. The air smelled faintly of fertilizer, overbrewed coffee, and something overly perfumed, a lavender-scented war zone where HOA bylaws ruled harder than gravity. Charles Benson pulled his SUV into the driveway of a tidy blue bungalow at the edge of Oak Ridge Lane. A crisp white shirt clung to his broad shoulders, tie loosened just enough to suggest he wasn't off-duty but not completely on it either. His freshly polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he stepped out, cradling a box of donuts in one hand and jingling a set of keys in the other. The keys were new, just handed to him yesterday, part of the housewarming package that came with his transfer. The house still needed work. Paint chips flaked off the porch rail. A mailbox leaned slightly, as if nodding in approval or exhaustion. But it was his now that he took a deep breath, gazing at the house. Quiet. Peaceful. Maybe boring, but in a good way. No flashing lights, no screaming, no radio dispatch crackling in his ear. Just a man delivering breakfast to the empty house he would soon move into. He approached the porch, unlocked the door, then paused. The door creaked open 2 inches before he pulled it shut again that he forgot the toolbox in the back seat. He'd only stopped by to drop the donuts off for the renovation crew coming later. No reason to leave the door hanging open. He turned to head back to the car. That's when she spotted him, across the street. A woman in fluorescent pink activewear stomped along the sidewalk like she owned it, and in her mind, she probably did. Mid-50s, helmet of sprayed blonde hair, and a face permanently set to mild disapproval, she pushed a stroller. But instead of a baby, it carried a small dog wearing goggles and a sweater. The schnauzer looked mortified. So did Charles. The woman stopped mid-step, narrowed her eyes, and immediately looked offended that he hadn't noticed her first. "Excuse me," she called out, voice slicing through the birdsong like a broken saxophone. Charles blinked. "Morning." She squinted harder, as if trying to enhance reality with sheer suspicion. "What are you doing over there?" He smiled politely. "Just dropping something off." "I live here." She scoffed. "Oh really? You live here?" He gestured to the key in his hand. "Yup. Just got the place." She didn't move. Her eyes darted from the donut box to his tie, to his dark skin, back to the donut box. The math didn't add up in her mind. And instead of accepting a miscalculation, she doubled down. "I don't think so. I know the Smiths who used to live there. They never mentioned selling." Charles shifted his weight, still holding the box, now slightly annoyed but trying not to let it show. "Well, the Smiths moved. I bought it. Paperwork and everything." She crossed her arms. "You got ID to prove that?" He laughed. "Do you normally ask your neighbors for ID?" Her lips thinned. "When they're acting suspicious, I do." "Suspicious," he repeated. "For unlocking my front door? You didn't even open the door. You just stood there." Charles blinked. "Lady, I'm carrying a box of donuts and a set of keys. What exactly do you think I'm plotting? A pastry-based heist?" She didn't find that funny. "I'm calling the police." He tilted his head. "Seriously? You don't live there. You're trying to break in, and I won't let that happen on my street." Charles exhaled through his nose, the way someone does when they've seen this dance 1,000 times and still can't believe the music's playing. But he said nothing. He simply leaned back against the porch post, popped the lid of the donut box, and selected a chocolate-glazed ring of diplomacy. He bit into it slowly, chewing thoughtfully as the woman stormed toward her phone, her finger jabbed at the screen with righteous fury. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual," she barked. "Tall, male, black, standing outside a home he doesn't belong to." He mouthed the words silently as she said them, rolling his eyes to the rhythm of her paranoia. If this were a movie, this would be the part where dramatic music swelled in the background. Maybe violins. Or a dramatic drumbeat. But reality didn't need music to highlight irony that he finished the donut and licked a smear of glaze from his thumb just as she declared, and he refused to open the door. That's aggressive, isn't it? A beat of silence, then a vague squawk from the dispatcher on the other end. I don't care if he has keys, she snapped. Thieves can have keys. He's loitering. That's a crime, right? Charles pinched the bridge of his nose that he'd seen a lot during his years in law enforcement. Robberies gone wrong. Domestic disputes. One guy tried to rob a gas station using a bag of frozen peas. But this was on another level of absurd. The dog in the stroller barked once, unenthusiastically. Even it seemed embarrassed, Karen, because by now, yes, she had reached full Karen mode, paced along the curb, watching him as though expecting him to suddenly transform into a cartoon villain. He leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and pulled out his phone. He wasn't going to call anyone. He just didn't want to look at her anymore. She put her phone down with a satisfied smile. They're on their way. Charles nodded. Cool. They bringing coffee? I'm fresh out. She didn't answer. She just stood there, arms crossed, breathing heavily like a mall cop who'd finally found someone parked in the fire lane. Minutes dragged out. A few houses down, a lawnmower kicked into gear. Someone's wind chime sang a nervous tune. A squirrel darted across the sidewalk and froze halfway, as if sensing the tension in the air. Then came the distant wail of sirens. Karen's eyes lit up like she'd just hit the bingo jackpot. She turned toward the street, face beaming in anticipation. Charles, meanwhile, took another donut from the box. Unbothered, the cruiser rolled to a stop just past the mailbox, lights spinning lazily. Two officers stepped out, young, fresh-faced, probably still figuring out the best place to keep their ticket books. They looked between Charles and Karen, visibly unsure who called and who needed backup. Karen pointed so fast, her arm nearly dislocated. That's him. That's the guy. The officers walked up the driveway cautiously. One of them made a slight nod toward Charles. Sir? Everything okay here? Charles straightened. Sure is. Just trying to enjoy a donut before I unpack more boxes. Karen huffed. He says he lives here. But he doesn't. He's loitering and refusing to cooperate. One of the officers tilted his head. Cooperate how? He wouldn't even open the door. What kind of criminal won't open the door when asked? The two officers glanced at each other. Even they weren't buying that logic. Charles cleared his throat, set the donut box down, and reached inside his jacket. Karen screamed, he's reaching for something. Charles held up a wallet slowly and flipped it open. Charles Benson, he said, calmly. Police chief. Your new boss. Both officers froze mid-step. A gust of wind swept through the street, rustling leaves, rattling porch chairs. The silence that followed was so sharp, it cut right through Karen's bluster. Her face went from triumphant to confused to pale. You're, what? She stammered. He pulled the badge from his wallet and extended it for the younger officer to inspect, appointed last week. Just moved in. Guess I should have introduced myself the traditional way, with sirens and a press conference. The officers stiffened. Sorry, Chief. We didn't know. No problem, Charles said coolly. You were just responding to a call. Nothing wrong with that. He turned to Karen, his voice calm but firm. Now, as for you, you might want to think twice before calling emergency services because someone didn't perform on command like a circus animal. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Next time, he added, maybe ask a name before assuming a crime. Saves everyone some time and a lot of embarrassment. He picked up his donut box, turned the key in the door, and walked inside without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Karen alone on the porch, the dog whining in its stroller as if to say, you blew it. From inside the house, Charles smiled. So much for peace and quiet, but something told him this neighborhood was going to be a little more eventful than he planned, and this? This was only the beginning. Karen had never backed away from a confrontation in her life, especially not when she thought she was right. Even now, with her cheeks flushed and her mind reeling from the awkward revelation, she clung to the belief that she'd merely made a reasonable mistake. She stood outside Charles's house long after the police cruiser left, staring at the front door like it owed her an apology. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her lips twitching with a cocktail of confusion, disbelief, and bruised pride. From behind drawn blinds, Charles watched her linger. He was sipping lukewarm coffee, standing barefoot on the hardwood floor of his newly acquired fixer-upper, already mentally drafting a list of plumbing issues and drywall patches. But now, there was a new item on his list: neighbor relations. Or, more accurately, damage control. He'd dealt with egos before. Politicians, angry parents at school board meetings, conspiracy theorists who insisted pigeons were government drones, but none quite as persistently delusional as the woman across the street with a schnauzer named Muffin and a vendetta built on air. Later that afternoon, while unpacking kitchen utensils that hadn't seen daylight since the Obama administration, Charles heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find not Karen, but her friend, Cheryl, wearing oversized sunglasses and an apologetic smile. "Hi there," she began cautiously, holding a Tupperware dish with trembling hands. "I, made lemon bars. Welcome to the neighborhood. And, sorry about this morning." She gets enthusiastic. Charles took the lemon bars, nodding. "Appreciate it." Cheryl gave a strained smile. She really didn't mean to, well. She just assumed. "You know how it is." "Oh, I know exactly how it is," Charles said, his voice polite but flat. Cheryl flinched, turned to leave, then hesitated. "Between us? She's not gonna drop it. She thinks you tricked her." "I unlocked my own front door," Charles replied. "Pretty advanced magic trick." That night, the quiet returned. For a while, anyway. But Karen wasn't the type to let go. Not when her pride had taken such a public hit. She needed the narrative flipped. She couldn't be the villain. That just wouldn't do. By morning, her plan was already in motion. It began with a letter, printed in bold Comic Sans, because of course it was. Folded in thirds and shoved into Charles's mailbox, the note read like a passive-aggressive poem written by someone who'd read half a Wikipedia article on neighborhood safety. "Dear Sir, while we welcome all new residents to Oak Ridge, we kindly request adherence to our community standards. Standing outside your home and refusing to provide proof of residence during a concerned neighbor's inquiry can cause unnecessary alarm. We value peace and safety. Let's work together to preserve it. Best regards, a concerned citizen." No signature. But the perfume? Unmistakably Karen. Charles laughed when he read it, even as he rolled his eyes. He couldn't decide what was more absurd, the gall, the tone, or the fact that she wrote, "concerned citizen," like she was applying for a cape and a utility belt. 2 days later, another knock came. This time, it wasn't baked goods. It was an envelope from the Homeowners Association. Inside, a formal complaint filed by a resident of Oak Ridge Lane, alleging that Charles had engaged in suspicious conduct, created unnecessary tension, and intimidated a neighbor during a wellness inquiry. "Wellness inquiry," he muttered aloud, pacing his kitchen. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The complaint demanded a response. An in-person HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Karen had weaponized the neighborhood bureaucracy. Charles had seen some desperate attempts at reputation rehab in his time, but this one took the gluten-free cake. Instead of apologizing or, at minimum, backing off, she was doubling down, trying to rewrite the narrative as if she were the vigilant guardian of suburban tranquility and not, in fact, the woman who tried to citizens arrest a man for delivering donuts. But Charles wasn't angry. Not really. He'd dealt with worse under higher stakes. What he was feeling now, more than anything, was disappointment. And a growing sense of bemused curiosity. What was her endgame? that question lingered all the way through the HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a soulless, echoing room with folding chairs, a table of warm juice boxes, and a bulletin board advertising piano lessons and lost cats. Karen sat at the front like she was chairing a Senate subcommittee. Cheryl sat beside her, clearly regretting every life choice that led her there. Charles entered quietly, wearing a short-sleeved button-up and slacks, still managing to look authoritative without trying. A few heads turned. Some nodded in greeting. Others whispered. Karen cleared her throat as he took a seat. "I think we all know why we're here," she began, standing with a sheet of paper in her hand like it was the Constitution. "This is not about race, or status, or," she paused dramatically, "personal feelings. It's about safety. It's about knowing who lives among us." Charles folded his hands in his lap and waited. Karen continued, detailing her version of events with the flair of a community theater actress auditioning for Law and Order. She emphasized how she had noticed unusual behavior, how she had politely requested identification, and how she had been met with sarcasm and passive resistance. When she finished, she turned to Charles and gave a tight smile. "I trust we can come to a neighborly understanding, Chief." He stood slowly, thanked the board, then calmly laid out the facts. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mock her. He simply stated what had happened: the key, the door, the donuts, and the conversation that followed. "I wasn't suspicious," he said. "I was standing on my own porch. I didn't escalate anything. I didn't refuse to identify myself. I simply didn't feel the need to perform compliance for someone demanding it without authority." There was a moment of silence. A few people nodded. One man coughed. Charles continued, voice steady. "I'm not here to cause conflict. I moved here to start fresh, just like any of you did once. But I won't tolerate being harassed on my own property. And I won't allow someone to twist reality because they don't want to admit they were wrong." He sat down. Karen, for once, didn't have a retort ready. The HOA chair, a woman named Diane with reading glasses perpetually on her forehead, looked between them. "Well," she said, "I think that settles the matter. There's no violation here. We move on." Karen tried to object, but Diane cut her off with a look that could slice drywall. Meeting adjourned. As people filtered out, several neighbors approached Charles. A nod here, a handshake there. Quiet affirmations. Some embarrassed. Some supportive. Karen lingered, her expression tight. She walked out without another word. That night, Charles stood on his porch, sipping fresh coffee and listening to the soft buzz of summer insects. From across the street, Karen's blinds twitched. He didn't need to look to know she was watching. He smiled. Her plan hadn't worked. Her complaint had collapsed under the weight of its own ridiculousness, but something told him she wasn't done, not yet. He took another sip of coffee and whispered to himself, "She's going to try again. And this time, he'd be ready." The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood had settled into an awkward calm, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, just waiting. Like the air before a thunderstorm. Charles could feel it. In the way Mrs. Adelson from 2 houses down avoided eye contact while watering her petunias. In how the joggers took slightly wider arcs around his driveway. No one said anything openly, but the tension clung to the lawns like dew. Karen hadn't spoken to him directly since the meeting, but her presence lingered in passive-aggressive ways. A new neighborhood watch sign appeared near the cul-de-sac. Someone, almost certainly her, filed a noise complaint about his moving crew, shouting obscenities, which turned out to be 3 guys loudly debating the best Fast and Furious movie. Charles didn't respond. Not yet, but the last straw came folded inside another envelope from the HOA, this time containing a new formal complaint, not from the board, but an individual submission demanding an ethics review of Charles's conduct as a public servant. The complaint accused him of weaponizing his badge to intimidate a civilian during a neighborhood concern and questioned whether his presence made residents feel unsafe. That was it. He'd been patient, polite, measured. He'd given Karen every possible opportunity to retreat gracefully. She hadn't just refused, she'd planted a flag and started building a sandcastle. Fine, Charles didn't like playing chess, but when he did, he liked winning in under 10 moves. And Karen? She'd left her king wide open that he made one phone call. "Hey cuz," he said into the receiver. "You still offering pro bono help for ridiculous nonsense?" His cousin, Monica Benson, had graduated top of her law school class and now ran a boutique firm specializing in civil liberties, defamation, and suburban stupidity, as she liked to put it. Her legal victories were the kind that made opposing counsel question their life choices. "Tell me everything," she said. He laid out the whole mess: Karen's accusations, the false reports, the formal complaints, and now this attempt to smear him professionally. By the time he finished, Monica was already typing. "You've got a harassment case, possibly defamation if this reaches any official inquiry. And it will, because she's clearly trying to provoke one. Let's cut the oxygen." She drafted a cease and desist the same day. A printed letter on firm stationery, delivered by courier to Karen's front door before lunch. Charles watched from his living room as Karen opened it, her eyebrows lifting like two startled caterpillars. She read the letter once, then again. Her mouth opened slightly, then shut. She turned sharply and slammed the door. Progress. Later that afternoon, Monica met Charles at his house for sweet tea and legal planning. "She wants attention and control," Monica said, glancing at the papers. "People like her don't care about right or wrong. They care about being right. And if they can't be, they want to be louder than the truth." "So what's next?" Charles asked. "Next," she said, smiling, "we give her the thing she fears most: accountability." By week's end, Charles had formally documented every incident, from the baseless 911 call to the slanderous HOA filings, and filed a harassment report through official city channels. He submitted evidence. Names. Times. Quotes. He even included her bizarre comment during the HOA meeting about needing to keep the community pure. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. But it was the first domino. Karen didn't react immediately. But a few days later, the neighborhood's tone shifted. Several neighbors who'd previously kept their distance began waving again. Some even knocked on his door, bringing small peace offerings, cookies, coffee beans, one awkward apology wrapped in banana bread. And Karen? She retreated. Slightly. She stopped walking her dog at 6:03 a.m. sharp. The curtain on her front window fluttered less frequently. But Charles knew better than to assume silence meant surrender. Sure enough, she re-emerged, this time, with a stack of printed flyers she handed out around the neighborhood. Thinly veiled as community concern bulletins, they warned of new residents with too much power, and individuals exploiting their status to escape scrutiny. It was absurd. Transparent. Childish, but it was also libel. Monica raised an eyebrow when she read one. "Well, she just handed you her shovel." "I thought she already hit the bottom of the hole," Charles said. "Oh, she's digging a basement now." They sent another letter. This time, a warning that any further public or private attempts to defame or interfere with Charles's role as a resident, or chief, would result in formal legal action. Karen responded by hiring a lawyer. Not a good one. A guy who used to run traffic school classes in a strip mall and once sued a cat cafe for emotional discomfort. At the mediation meeting arranged by the city's Community Affairs Board, Karen arrived wearing a blazer 2 sizes too small and an expression that screamed rehearsed humility. Her lawyer flipped through papers like he'd studied them in the parking lot. Charles, by contrast, wore calm and clarity. He let Monica handle most of the talking. She pointed out the documented incidents, the pattern of behavior, and the clear intent to defame and harass. She cited local statutes. She highlighted city protocols. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she was simply engaged in vigilant community defense. "Your client called 911 because someone didn't open a door fast enough," Monica said. She then attempted to discredit a public official using false claims and racially charged insinuations. "That's not vigilant. That's libel wrapped in bigotry. Karen muttered something under her breath. The city mediator leaned forward. We're offering you an off-ramp here. A formal apology, withdrawal of all complaints, and a written agreement not to initiate further contact. Or we proceed, and you risk legal exposure. Karen looked trapped, like a raccoon caught in a recycling bin with the lid slammed shut. In the end, she signed. Begrudgingly. Without eye contact. Her pen shook. The board closed the meeting with curt nods. Monica slid the signed document into her briefcase with a graceful snap. Sweet, sweet legal karma, she whispered as they walked out. The next week, Karen's property received a visit from the HOA, not because of Charles, but due to an anonymous tip about a gazebo installed without a permit and 2 illegal lawn gnome displays. Charles didn't smile. Outwardly. But inside? He grinned. Her nameplate as HOA secretary disappeared a few days later. Cheryl replaced her. The first meeting under new leadership ended with a potluck featuring, at Cheryl's very deliberate suggestion, welcome donuts, as the theme. Charles brought glazed. Karen did not attend, but Charles did catch her looking through her window again as he returned home. She saw him glance her way, and for the first time since this all began, she looked down. No words. No glares. Just a quiet retreat behind the blinds that he exhaled, stepping onto his porch as the evening light painted the sidewalk gold. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about peace. About sending a clear message: respect isn't optional, and decency has consequences when you abandon it. Still, as the front door shut behind him and the donuts cooled on the table, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. That basement Karen had dug, she'd finally hit the pipes. And now the whole block knew, but something still lingered in the air, unfinished, unspoken. Charles had a feeling this wasn't the last chapter. Not just yet. The next few weeks passed quietly, or at least, more quietly than before. Spring rolled in like a peace offering, breezy mornings, blooming dogwoods, and the faint hum of lawnmowers droning like suburban meditation. For once, Charles had the luxury of a normal rhythm. Morning runs, black coffee, meetings at the precinct, the occasional repair project around the house. The usual. No police sirens, no dramatic HOA summons, and most importantly, no unsolicited flyers shoved into his mailbox. Still, something in the air felt unresolved. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The kind of trained gut feeling honed from years in law enforcement, where a suspect's silence usually meant they were thinking, not surrendering. Karen hadn't spoken to him directly since the mediation. She hadn't filed any new complaints or sent coded letters. She hadn't even walked her schnauzer, Muffin, past his property. But that didn't mean she'd given up. It just meant she was waiting for her next move, or maybe her final one. That move came in the form of a thick envelope addressed to the Office of Internal Affairs. Someone, again, anonymously, had submitted a formal ethics complaint against Charles, accusing him of abusing his position to silence residents, threatening civil litigation for personal gain, and engaging in retaliatory behavior under the guise of professionalism. The language was vague enough to imply doubt but pointed enough to raise eyebrows. The kind of document that, even if dismissed, could leave a faint shadow in the wrong circles. Charles didn't blink. He didn't shout, didn't throw a mug against the wall or march across the street to demand answers. He did what he always did, handled it cleanly, quietly, and by the book. He requested a formal hearing, not just to address the complaint, but to make sure it happened in a space where truth couldn't be twisted. If Karen wanted to play one final card, he'd flip the table and show everyone the full deck. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, in the old city administration building, neutral ground. Charles arrived early, dressed in uniform, every button crisp, every thread immaculate. He looked like a man who wasn't just prepared to speak the truth, he was the truth. Across the room, Karen sat at a small table with the same ineffective attorney from before, nervously flipping through documents as though the answers might suddenly appear in the margins. She looked less defiant this time. Tired, almost. But not repentant. The panel of administrators reviewed her complaint first. They read every sentence. Asked every clarifying question. Charles sat in silence, hands folded. He didn't flinch once, then it was his turn that he stood, voice steady but firm. He spoke not just about Karen, but about the pattern. About assumptions. About how easily people could wield fear when accountability made them uncomfortable. About the burden of proving his worth twice over, once in his badge, and once to a woman who decided he didn't look right on her block that he cited dates. Times. Evidence. Documents. He never called her racist. He didn't have to. Her actions spoke fluently. When he finished, there was no rebuttal. Karen's lawyer tried to shuffle some papers and mutter something about reasonable concern, but it didn't land. Not this time. The panel conferred briefly before issuing their decision. Complaint dismissed. Unfounded. No further action, but that wasn't the end point. One of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and 30 years of public service behind her, leaned forward and asked Karen directly, "Would you like to offer a formal apology to Chief Benson for what's clearly been an abuse of our review process?" Karen's mouth twitched. I was just trying to protect the community." The board member didn't blink. From a man standing on his own porch with donuts? Karen glanced at her lawyer, but he was already stuffing papers back into his briefcase like he couldn't wait to leave. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then, finally, with a voice dry as old toast, Karen said, "I apologize." Charles nodded, expression unreadable. "Thank you," he replied simply, and that was it. It should have ended there. But fate had one last encore point. 2 days later, an unmarked car pulled up outside Karen's house. A city inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand. Turns out someone had flagged several zoning violations tied to her property, an illegal backyard shed, an expired fence permit, and, curiously, unlicensed construction work on her gazebo. Charles didn't file the report. He didn't have to. After everything, Karen had made herself a beacon. People had stopped fearing her. Now, they simply didn't respect her. The HOA followed shortly after, hitting her with fines and a notice of disciplinary action for repeated misuse of procedural channels, and then came the kicker. At the next town hall meeting, someone nominated Charles to serve on the Community Oversight Committee. Not just as a token gesture, but as someone who represented the kind of leadership the neighborhood needed, calm, principled, and unshakably fair. That he accepted. The next block event was held 2 weeks later, an outdoor gathering filled with picnic tables, music, balloons, and cheerful chaos. Kids ran barefoot through sprinklers, dogs chased frisbees, and someone manned a grill like it was the Super Bowl. Charles stood near the lemonade stand, sipping from a paper cup as neighbors came up to shake his hand, share stories, or just say they were glad he'd moved in. It wasn't redemption. He hadn't done anything wrong to redeem. But it was restoration. A real welcome. And across the street, Karen watched from her porch. She wasn't wearing a smile. Her dog sat silently beside her, tail unmoving. For once, she didn't wave. She didn't scowl. She just sat there, frozen in the same spot where it all started. Charles caught her gaze and nodded once, not out of spite, not with smugness, but with finality. That he turned back to the celebration, accepted a second plate of barbecue, and joined the laughter. The door she tried to keep him from walking through was now wide open, and the neighborhood? It had finally come to life. As the sun dipped below the treetops and the air filled with the warm haze of evening, Charles raised his lemonade in an impromptu toast and said, "To good neighbors, better donuts, and knowing when to shut your front gate." They laughed. The good kind, the deep-bellied, snorting kind that echoes long after it's gone. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been baked, boxed, and delivered with sprinkles.